What? Yeah.
Welcome to Bedroom Interviews. We're with Alex Matthews today. Thank you so much for coming. So, Alex does Vintage Society, which are interviews and podcast series about music, about the Glasgow music scene, and about lots of different things, actually. Before we dive into that, I was going to ask you, what was your relationship with music growing up, and are you a musician yourself?
Yeah, I play the saxophone, alto saxophone, which I started when I was like 10 or something and kind of played all the way through school. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I was always kind of into music growing up from quite a young age. And then the kind of usual when you become a teenager, you kind of get into the indie thing and then into rock and then punk and then hip hop and everything through that. And yeah, just quite a natural kind of organic progression through self discovery in music.
Nice one. About that, what was the first album you bought, and what was the last album you bought?
First album I bought was, I think it was a Michael Jackson like greatest hits compilation after he died, which maybe hasn't aged too well as a choice. But yeah, I remember getting that on CD in Tesco's and listening to that a lot. And the last album I bought, good question. I'm trying to think. I bought an album on vinyl a few weeks ago, but I'm trying to think what it was.
Not your favorite one, then maybe.
I can't remember. I bought a Massive Attack Heligoland in January. I remember buying that, so we'll go with that. But there was another one, but I can't remember what it was.
Oh well, maybe not the most influential
Oh,
record of your life then.
it was the Night Cafes album.
Nice one.
Yeah, that was the last one I bought.
Sweet. Thanks. Let's just dive in and see about Vintage Society. So, I feel like you might be as young as me right now. Are you like 19 or 20 right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. So, when did you start Vintage Society? Were you like super young, like 17 or something?
Yeah, I was 17 when I started.
That's wild. So how did that come about? Did you have any prior projects that were similar that involved into the Vintage Society, or how did you
Yeah,
get the idea?
I did a lyric video for an Edinburgh band called Lost in Vancouver. So I used to make a lot or did little music videos and stuff and short films and all that kind of jazz. Study film rather. So I made a lyric video for them, and through that I ended up writing for a site called Pure Culture, which was like an Edinburgh-based or kind of Edinburgh, Glasgow-based Scottish music blog. And then I wrote for them for a couple of months, and then ended up being content manager for a few months after that. And then I kind of felt like I wanted to incorporate the kind of filmed aspect into it. So through that, I started doing Vintage Society, kind of evolved from that because I thought it would be better to kind of do that as a separate thing. And then when I started to do more stuff with that, I left Pure Culture and just started doing Vintage. And then from that, we kind of went into filmed interviews. Then we did like sessions and other little bits and bobs. And now in COVID times, the podcast has kind of become the main thing when filmed interviews aren't quite as viable.
Yeah, fair enough. These podcasts are quite impressive. I haven't listened to a lot of them, but I was busy listening to, for example, the Methyl Ethyl one today, and I was quite kind of blown away by the kind of scope of people you've managed to interview. Like Jack Saunders is your fourth episode, and things like that. How do you manage to get like quote unquote as like people as famous as these? Just do you just contact them? How do you work that out?
Yeah, I've got quite a lot of press contacts now that I work with on a regular basis, so that's handy to kind of get stuff through that, which I've just built up from doing it for 2 years. Like if you do it for a while, you kind of just, by the nature of it, end up meeting people and working with them repeatedly, and then through that, you develop quite a good working relationship. But yeah, for like Methyl Ethyl and Jack Saunders and stuff, that was literally just getting in touch, and I usually always send over one of the podcasts that we've done before. And quite often, when people choose to come on, it's because they've listened to it or they listen to the episode I sent through and then kind of like it or whatever, dig the vibe, and then decide to come on and have a chat.
That's class. Yeah, I'm really impressed actually. Yeah, yeah. About the kind of relationship you have between having all these podcasts, which obviously with the COVID might have taken over a bit, like you said, and the actual filmed interviews with the bands. You have like really different formats there. You're playing with like content that's kind of like more visual, under 20 minutes, and really kind of more in depth conversations. And do you feel like it's important to have both, or do you have something you prefer?
Yeah, well, I think they kind of feed into each other. Like if you can definitely learn things from one of them that you can then apply to the other one. Particularly with the video ones, I think I'm not always the best at kind of expressing what I want to say in a concise and kind of clear way. And the video ones kind of help with practice at that because you need to when you're doing it under 20 minutes. But then through the podcast, you kind of learn a lot about songwriting and the kind of topics that tend to spark something in an artist, the questions that tend to be good at kind of getting something out of them, which you can then kind of utilize to greater effect in the filmed interviews. So yeah, I think it is important to have both and kind of allow them just to feed into each other and impact each other in a natural kind of way.
Definitely. What's one of the most interesting things you've ever heard someone say to you in one of these interviews or podcasts? Something that really like struck you?
Good question. I'm trying to think. I had a really interesting conversation last night on the podcast with Peter from the Antlers. He came on, which is coming out in a few weeks. And yeah, I'm trying to think what we were just talking a lot about kind of understanding yourself and how what you might often think are negative aspects of yourself through time, instead of trying to get rid of them, you can kind of learn to use them as positives and kind of control them and use them in a way that impacts your life in a positive way. So that's, I mean, that's one off the top of my head. It's hard to say though. They kind of all start to blend a little bit because I'm recording like 5 a week at the moment or something. So they start to, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say these podcasts have been coming out at a regularity that has really impressed me because it is like 40 odd minute long content we're talking about that comes out like I was looking like Leah, how many twice a week, 3 times a week or something?
5 now.
Like for the past few months, and I was just wondering like how do you deal with having to like is that your kind of full-time occupation? And also because you're interviewing people from various parts of the world, do you find yourself up at ridiculous times at night interviewing people from America or something?
Yeah, I mean, my sleep schedule is kind of running on American time a little bit. Yeah, I tend to go to bed at like 4 or 5 in the morning and then get up at like 10 or 11.
That's proper
Which
wild.
probably isn't the best, but
Well, let's just ask the question on everyone's lips. How do you come up with questions? I feel like that's your kind of main thing people will remember from your interviews, especially, and also your podcast is just your kind of knack at.
I mean, I've kind of developed really over the last few months, mostly is kind of when I've settled into quite a good structure for it, where what I kind of do to start is basically read every interview I can with the band, kind of taking notes as I go through. Then I go through their entire Instagram page, taking notes of interesting things, and then from that you kind of amass quite a bulk of kind of notes and information, and then I kind of arrange that, and then through that the questions just come out. But yeah, to be honest, like I can't really explain it. It's I guess it's like asking where does like a melody come from or something. It's like I just think of questions when I hear music. Like I think I've always been a little bit like that with everything. I've always kind of been a bit inquisitive, I guess. But yeah, it's hard. I don't know where they come from. Like if I'm listening to something, they just kind of start to spark. There's nothing I can do to get them going. Sometimes they don't. That can be frustrating. Sometimes, like I can do like 3 hours research and just nothing happens, and then another time I can do an hour and basically get tons of stuff. It's weird. I've no idea. I wish I knew. If I knew where they came from, it would be a bit easier probably to do the research side of it.
That's really interesting. Um, yeah, amazing. Yeah, okay. Well, about that, what would be your advice for aspiring slash up and coming interviewers or podcasters that might be listening out there to kind of like your main tips or things you've learned along the way that you would like people to hear?
I would just say do it as much as you can. Like do as many interviews as you can. Work on it as much as you can because you learn so much just from doing. I've not really. I think when I first started off, I looked up like the most common questions and decided I wasn't going to ask them. And then I tried a few times to kind of look at journalism kind of articles and stuff on advice and interviews, and I never really got much from them. Literally everything I know and the way I kind of go about it is purely from doing. Like even so now, I've been doing it 2 years and I'm now doing it more than ever and learning more than ever still. Like you kind of find the more you learn, you realize that the less you actually knew, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So like it just continually keeps building and building and building. So yeah, I mean, I think the one piece of advice I would give would just be do it as much as you can, interview as many people as you can, speak to as many people as you can. Yeah.
Good advice. Absolutely. Do you see yourself doing Vintage Society then for kind of as long as you can? Or do you have any other projects in mind or things you'd like to try?
Yeah, yeah, probably for the foreseeable at least. I need to figure out a way to make money off of it. That's the that's the main concern. But yeah, I think for the next few years at least, yeah, I want to get to a point where the podcast is filmed, which will probably be a few years away yet. I feel like I kind of need to amass a bulk before I move on to that. But yeah, I like it. I like the fact that it's kind of an evolving project and you can kind of take it in lots of directions. And like, if you look at what it was when it first started, it's completely different now. It has changed a lot, and that's what I like about it compared to any other creative projects I worked on in the past. Is that it's like a continuous thing. There's no endpoint for it. It just keeps evolving, and that's what kind of makes it so satisfying to work on.
Absolutely. About that, if you look back on the hours and hours of content you've created now, is there anything that stands out to this day that when you think back on it, you're still feeling like extremely proud about it? Maybe not necessarily that we have to make a scale of things you're more proud of than others, but is there anything that you were just like really satisfied to have done?
Um, the last podcast I did, I
Is
have
that
this thing because I'm still kind of progressing so much, and the learning curve is still quite steady, and I'm still learning so much that I kind of struggle to like anything I've done that's like over 2 weeks old, just because I feel like everything like a few weeks on is better. So you kind of just have to accept. You want to feel like you've done a good job at that point. So if I've done it and I felt like at the time it was a good job, then I'm kind of reasonably okay with that. But yeah, usually like if you were to ask me this in 2 weeks, I would probably say like the podcast I did the night before. If it's been a good one, generally just like the last one. But I'm trying to think. We had a podcast come out the other day with Carlos, who used to play in Interpol, who are my favorite band. So probably that, just because that was quite a big one for me. But yeah, it's hard to kind of pin down. I don't really think about it too much like that. I'm kind of quite focused on the next thing that's kind of coming, as opposed to what I've done.
that's good. That's a good way of looking at it. About you're talking about looking forwards and everything. Why that's not much of a transition, but why vintage society? What's vintage about your society?
Um, Good question. I think the way where the name came from was looking around at all the bands kind of just kicking around in vintage clothing, and I think it was kind of riffing on. I think originally I thought about calling it like Caffeine Society or something. I think I was kind of riffing on the Woody Allen film, and then kind of wanted to change it and make it a bit different. And yeah, it felt like something that kind of summed up a lot of the music that I was covering at that time.
Do you feel like yeah, that's interesting because I was listening to uh someone in your podcast today going how most of the music that is made is trying to be vintage or futuristic, but not right now, or something like that. And it was quite interesting.
Oh yeah, was
Um,
that the other one?
I think so. Yeah, that was cool.
I think we were
Um,
talking whether the future of music is going to be
yeah,
futuristic. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it'll be both. Like it's we're kind of in this postmodern age where you can kind of recycle everything, but kind of put a modern twist on it. It's
yeah,
interesting. Be involved in like music,
it's very
looking at
interesting
this before.
for sure. What's kind of interesting about the fact that you have these interviews that are kind of more not totally focused on the Glasgow music scene, but kind of primarily focused on the Glasgow music scene, and the podcasts which go way, way, way beyond. Um, that means you're like a real kind of yeah, you're a real part of the Glasgow music scene, but at the same time, you really must have like a kind of outside view on it a bit. And I was wondering, what do you think of the dynamics and creativity that we have here in Glasgow compared to other parts of the world and maybe other scenes you've might have encountered?
Um, yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I'm like what you were saying there. I don't feel like I'm quite. I feel like I kind of work with the scene as opposed to being a part of it. If that makes sense. Like I feel like I'm kind of on like the outer edges of it, which is what I quite like. So like you say, you kind of get that perspective on it. I don't know. There's a real. I think the thing about Glasgow is it kind of gets that nice Scottish thing where there's a real kind of community feel about it. If you know what I mean.
Hmm.
Because it's a massive city, it still kind of feels like everyone knows everyone to a certain degree, which isn't something like you kind of get cliques and stuff in London, but not the same degree, which is the kind of nice thing about it. And that's probably what makes it a little bit different. I think over the last few years, we've kind of seen the genres of music start to diversify a little bit more. Like a couple of years ago, maybe a few years back, it was kind of still a lot of the hangover from the kind of indie boom, the 2010s. And it was maybe getting a little bit tired, but it feels now like there's a lot of interesting kind of voices coming out, which is hopefully something that'll continue. Like that would be cool to see if it kind of keeps diversifying and we keep getting, instead of it just kind of being one genre of thing, we get like, we're speaking about metal athlete. If you look at the Australian scene at the moment, like everyone's kind of doing a different thing, but they've all kind of still got something that unifies them.
What kind of interesting voices can you think of right now? You kind of like in the music scene right now in Glasgow?
Van Ives are a big one for me. Russell Stewart, I thought his new single was really great.
Hmm.
Uh, Ninth Wave are another one. This is always, whenever you ask, it's always like you can never remember. I'm trying to think. Yeah, those are the three that kind of spring to my mind. Definitely. Oh, I really like Snack Villain. He's great. He's done some really cool stuff.
Cool.
I'm trying to think who I've had on the podcast. Because yeah. What about for yourself?
Oh, they're flipping the script here. I think some of my favourite sounds right now from Glasgow are probably my main three would be Fiends Whitey, The Bleeders, Into the Stone Immaculate.
I guess Stone Immaculate. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Kind of like what we were saying earlier about how you know what we're doing now. Like there's this kind of retro thing going on where you can take an old style and kind of reappropriate it. Like despite the fact that they're doing stuff that maybe could have been done a little while back, they've all got such distinct personalities. That's what makes their music really interesting and cool. Because it
Absolutely.
feels to them.
Oh fuck. Oh, you had a wee second of static here. I think one of two of your words might have been chipped out. You were saying it's very cool, and then
Yeah, it's just very personal and unique to them.
yeah, exactly. No, absolutely. Um, it's kind of a more general question. You might not have an answer to it, but what's one thing just off the top of your head you'd like to change about the music industry as we know it?
Um, Good question. More emphasis on quality as opposed to quantity. I think there's this kind of habit where one thing will take off and then you'll get kind of a myriad of different artists trying to replicate it and basically ride on its coattails. But I mean, it's the same thing with the interview format as well. Like it can be frustrating sometimes when the kind of classic music industry approach to interviews will be that you'll have a press day for 8 hours where you'll do like 4 interviews an hour and they'll all be 15 minutes. None of them will be very good because you don't have enough time. But the whole point is just to try and get as many people covering it as possible. And if we could start, I think it's just such an old fashioned way of looking at it. Like if we could try and move towards, like what I'm trying to do with the podcast, where you kind of take a bit more time, you try and go more in depth, and you try and actually get something interesting that would be something people can maybe get something from when they listen to it instead of like a 10-minute interview where you get, your classic, what's your songwriting process? How did you get the band name?
Mm,
Yeah, more of an emphasis on quality rather than quantity, I think.
definitely. Talking about quantity, just because of the extraordinary amount of podcasts have, you're already on number what, 78 or something. uh
Uh, yeah, 80 something,
and
I think.
and I can't even count how many interviews you got. For someone who might be relatively new to discovering you, is there any like one podcast and one interview you'd like recommend to start with?
Good question. Again, I'm trying to think what I've put out recently. It depends what you're into. I think the thing I would say is maybe the Peach Pit one's all right. It's pretty decent. I think the thing with the podcast is you get more out of it if you're into the artist that I'm speaking to. It's not really a podcast, I think, where I mean, I guess you could. I think it's you get more from the podcast, yeah, if you know the artist that I'm speaking to. So maybe just scroll through, find an artist that interests you or that you're a fan of, and then kind of dive in on that one. It's kind of different for
Mhm.
everyone, I think, because
Okay.
we tend to go a little bit in depth on the music itself.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good answer. Thank you so much for answering all my questions today. That was really great.
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me on.